Paul go about announcing to the band that he was working on McCartney 2, and that was going to be coming out as his next release as part of the Columbia deal?
Well, I think, Paul's entitled to do whatever he likes. And so it was like, because he had the time over the summer and some gear to play around with, and and he felt like, I can do an album this way. I don't need the band.
Did it come as a surprise or a shock?
No, I was busy working on my own album at the time. I mean, my Standard Time record, which was stuff out of Paul's publishing catalog, was recorded right around that. It was August, September of that year. You just kind of go with the flow under those circumstances. I mean, it's not like you're going to argue with Paul McCartney saying, well, you can't do this, And, I think that Arrow Through Me really was a bit of a precursor to McCartney too, because it was that very stripped down kind of with a little quirkiness to it, with a double speed drum kit and stuff like that on it. That I still think is one of his best songs of that era. I'm surprised that it hasn't been covered by jazz singers, because it's actually really a very cool, very cool song.
And how was that recorded? Because on the video, you're all playing keyboards.
Right, but on the record, it's just Paul and Steve Holley, because there's no bass.
So you're not on the record at all?
Not on that, no. I contributed to the horn arrangement,
right?
But not on the actual recording, because it was just literally, it was Paul playing electric piano, and Steve playing two drum kits, played regular drums and double speed drums, and that was it, plus the horns. But that Paul will do stuff like that. I mean, he did it with the Beatles, where he'd run in the studio and cook up a track all by himself. I mean, because he can. But I think that the process by which we did Back to the Egg, and then we didn't actually perform it live for some months after the record was released, I think was very much part of that kind of the slowing down, because I think prior to that, they would have put the record out and immediately gone out on the road. Record comes out in June. We didn't tour until November. Steve and I went to New York and promoted the release. And then, they had, but even the video special that we did, which was broadcast in America, I think didn't get broadcast until October or November of that year too. So there was a little kind of out of sync in terms of the way that perhaps in a previous release might have happened.
We had to wait 2 years in the UK for the BBC to finally air Back to the Egg.
Really, it took that long?
Years,
okay. Yeah, I was already by then. I was already in so yeah, but that's how these things happen sometimes.
And if that was, I mean, if MTV had come along in '79, and there might have been a different story about the success of that album.
Well, that's true, because I remember I went to see Hunter Ronson in New York, and they were filming it for something that was going to be called MTV. It was like 1980. So I think part of the problem there was that we were actually kind of a little ahead of the curve. The other thing that happened in the States was that Old Siamsa was a single, but it came out the same time as the Knack's My Sharona, which had a very similar riff, because both records were coming from this kind of power pop / rock perspective. And some of the radio stations would play the tracks back to back. And again, ironically, that was, the Knack were on Capitol. So all the energy that would have gone into Back to the Egg from Capitol actually went into the Get the Knack album. And Columbia, not having the institutional memory of how to promote McCartney, which Capitol did, I think just they kind of took it for granted that it was going to sell multi-millions simply because it was McCartney. And, and I mentioned earlier the fact that you had, Rumors and these albums that were, and Boston, that were selling substantial numbers. But literally the week that Back to the Egg came out, there was a recession in America. They dated the recession to that week. And so kind of like the bottom fell out of the record market at the same time. So, if the record had been released even 6 months earlier, it probably would have sold double or triple. If Goodnight Tonight had been on it, it would have sold a lot more. And perhaps under those circumstances, the critics would have been less critical. But, I think that, and it wasn't all the critics either. I mean, it was just, enough to get Paul kind of feeling a bit jaundiced about it.
In my opinion, Old Siam's is one of the last great rockers that Paul did. Where did that monstrous riff come from?
Are you talking about on the instrumental section?
Yeah.
That came out of the jam. That was when Steve was playing piano and Paul and I were playing guitar, and somehow it just, I forget who started it, but that's where it came from.
Do you feel, Laurence, that ultimately Paul did not keep faith with Wings based on the sales of Back to the Egg? And we're talking about a platinum selling album in America here. Do you think that was his decision to say, okay, I'm going to do this by myself? I can't cope with a critical failure, even though everyone here tonight thinks it's brilliant?
I'm not sure that that's quite that black and white with it. It might have been a contributing factor. I think an equally contributing factor was the fact that Wings was Paul and Linda's band, and Linda was just getting tired. She, and they, in the course of doing it, they had moved out of London. They were no longer at Cavendish, they were at Peasmarsh, and the kids were in local schools. It was one of the reasons we worked at Lim Castle, was because it was an easy drive for them. So that, and then of course, by the time, the Paul got busted in Tokyo, which was kind of very hard on Linda because they'd never been apart for that long. And it was, it was not an easy period at all. But I think it just got to the point where it was, Paul was ready for a change of direction. So, but, you kind of expect changes of direction. With Wings, I mean, the fact that it went through the number of incarnations that it did.
If we can take you back to the rehearsals prior to the 79 tour, please. I believe they were in Eastbourne.
The Eastbourne rehearsals were when we had the full tech.
Right.
We were in a theater. Yeah.
How did you decide? How was it decided what was going to go on the set list, and what did you jam or record or rehearse or whatever, which didn't actually make it onto the final set list?
Well, I think that by the time we got to Eastbourne, we pretty much were set with what was going to be in the show. The place that we were kind of working it out was actually in this little, almost like a shed near Peasmarsh. There's that video that we did for the Japanese, like a little promo for the Japanese tour, where we were rehearsing. We started rehearsing Coming Up, and we did With a Little Luck, which we dropped, even though that had been a hit single. It just didn't feel right. Again, because it was kind of like a very pop single, as opposed to the band, which was kind of leaning more towards a rock and roll direction. I know that we opened with Got to Get You Into My Life because Earth, Wind and Fire had a hit with it. Which I think from the Sgt. Pepper soundtrack, the movie soundtrack or something. But I think that kind of spurred Paul to say, oh, wait a minute, that's my song. And it was a good opener too.
And he also did 20 Flight Rock, which is a song obviously very personal to Paul.
Oh yeah, well that was his audition piece for John, wasn't it? And I think Paul liked to strap on a guitar and play a bit. Hot as Sun, again, I mean, that was kind of Paul wanting to play some guitar. plug the Epiphone into the AC30, and but those were the only two that he played electric guitar on, if I recall.
But it must have been great doing Every Night, Laurence, because you do a good solo on that, and it was a song which has not been played by him up to that point.
That's true. Yeah, that was kind of a cool one to do. And I just kind of approached it pretty freely in terms of what I did with it. The curious one was Maybe I'm Amazed, because he changed the arrangement on that. The sequence of the song is a little different from the original version, or for the version that he did, with Jimmy and Joe English. But yeah, I mean, I think that Every Night was because he'd never done that at all, had he? It was not in any of the set lists. So that was kind of a refreshing thing, I think.
But it still hasn't done it since.
And I don't understand why, because it's such a great song.
I know.
But then he has more than a few great songs. I mean, let's face it.
Did you get any insight into how he would make those decisions? Like how he would suddenly say, right, we're going to just play this song now that I haven't played for whatever 10 years.
I don't recall much in the way of discussion as to how the set list was going to go. I mean, putting together a set list has its, has its pitfalls, because you can say, oh, I want to do this song, but then if you do it kind of like after another song that's in the same key, you lose a certain amount of impact. So it's a juggling act when you're doing stuff like that. And I think probably my feeling was I just stay out of the way. Yeah.
So was that set list decided entirely by McCartney, or like did like yourself, like, and others have like some input and like suggestions? Just considering it is there's a lot of deep cuts in it, like things like Every Night and like Hot as Sun and that, and certainly like today he keeps it rather safe with his set list. So was that like the influence of like yourself, like, or others?
I don't think I had any real influence on that set list. I mean, there were certain things like Cook of the House was in there because Paul wanted Linda to have a vocal. Let It Be was just such a natural thing to put in there. And I'm not sure what the motivation was. I mean, there were very few Beatles songs. We had Got to Get You Into My Life. We had Fool on the Hill. We had Let It Be, Yesterday. Not like in recent years where it's basically kind of a Beatle tribute band.
We've not heard the word Rockestra mentioned yet, I don't think, during this chat. What's your memories of that, Laurence, in terms of the vibe in the room? Was there any egos among all the people who gathered for it?
Rockestra was actually remarkably ego-free. It was really like everybody just was in there just being part of it. And that's the thing, is because Paul commands so much respect amongst his peers, that him, kind of being the musical director of it all and just kind of assigning the parts, everybody just went with it, and it's, I mean, for me, it was like remarkable because I've got Hank Marvin right next to me, who's my childhood hero. And then, next to him, Denny Lane, and then Dave Gilmour and Pete Townsend. I mean, I was in heaven, and, there's John Bonham on drums and Steve Holley and Kenny Jones. And it was really, it was a remarkable band. And there were a lot of technical challenges involved in it because they were running, first time I'd ever seen two 24-track machines running in sync. They had to bring in an extra console into the control room for all the inputs. But ego-wise, everybody was cool about it. I mean, and it's unfortunate that the full movie never got edited together because, the whole thing was filmed and there was that short promo that got, kind of resurfaced, but they had neglected to get releases from everybody. When you do videos, you're supposed to get a release saying it's okay.
I think there's a suggestion as to why there's been a delay with the archive collection. There might be still some issues around that potentially. I
have no idea.
No.
I I have not heard anything about the archive collection. I'm doing an interview for the documentary. I'm doing an interview this coming week. That's, I forget who the director is, but it's the documentary that covers that 70s period.
Is that the Man on the Run documentary?
It could be. I'm not sure, actually. Let me hang on. If
Morgan Neville, I think, was announced in February, so it has been announced.
Hang on. There's a few documentaries. This is the MPO one that Morgan Neville is directing.
Yeah, that's the one. Man on the Run, it's called. Yeah.
Is that what it's called? Yeah.
Can't wait.
Yeah, he does. I mean, he did 20 Feet from Stardom, which is a great documentary. But the interviews are all audio only, so there's going to be a lot of visuals because they're not doing. Normally you're kind of like a talking head, when you do interviews. But for this one, it's just an audio thing. But they're coming over here on Tuesday to do that. I have not heard anything more about the archive collection.
What about that amazing final Wings concert in Glasgow, which obviously there's bootlegs floating around, Wings' last flight. It was professionally recorded.
Well, Jeff Emmerich engineered it.
Yeah. Will that ever see the light of day? I mean, there's been a few tracks that have sort of seeped out on the archive editions over time, bonus editions, but we've not had that whole concert, which is an amazing concert.
Imagine that if and when, or when and if the archive collection comes out, that would be on it, along with the Kampuchea video, and probably the Rupert demos too. Because there's the Rupert Bear stuff that we did it was like a one-day thing when we were up in Scotland. But, some of that stuff turned out really nicely too. Actually, amazing how much we accomplished in a day for that. And by the end, you can hear the piano starting to go out of tune.
There's just so much material from that period, visual and audio, that it could be included in an archive edition. It's we just hope Paul gets around to it.
Well, one would hope so. It's hard to know. I mean, he found the time to do 80 singles. Have the box sitting over there. Yeah.
But Laurence, I mean, speak on behalf of the people in this group and numerous others. We think it's scandalous that London Town and Back to the Egg have not received archive treatment. I mean, they're not minor albums; they're fucking great albums. So I just don't understand it.
Yeah, I don't quite understand it either. And next time I have any communication with Paul, I actually intend to kind of bring it up.
Yeah. If he doesn't, suddenly we'll send John round to sort him out. So,
yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's a bit of a mystery, but I mean, I imagine that at some point in the foreseeable future, it'll come out. Right now, I mean, today is Red Road Speedway vinyl, at least over here it is. And, I don't know if there's going to be anything different because Band on the Run 50th anniversary is coming up in December.
Well, we don't need another version of that because we've already got it.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just waiting for these last two Wings albums. And if he brings out an archive edition of Broad Street, we're all going to...
Yeah, we don't need that.
Be so upset.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if it's a little bit like the whole selective memory that all the Beatles had about the Let It Be movie. They had it in their heads that it was a terrible time, and Peter Jackson's remake of that is joyous. It shows the complete opposite of how they felt about it at the time. Do you think Paul might have, for whatever reason, got it into his head that it's not a great album just based on the relative lack of sales, and that he might reappraise it and see the light as we've done over the years?
I mean, one refers to relative lack of sales. It's still, I don't think any subsequent album has sold as much as Back to the Egg. Or maybe Tug of War did because of the Michael Jackson stuff there too. But
He's got something in his head that it's not a good album.
well, I think, yeah,
Tug of War,
it
that
is. But the fact is that, you know, the Let It Be period, you know, was a hard time for the Beatles. I mean, the band was, you know, functionally breaking up. But the beauty of the documentary is that it shows that it didn't matter what the friction was, that just got turned into creative energy. I think that, you know, but I do think that that particular period, the Back to the Egg period for Paul, because he was turning 40 and because Linda was getting tired and because he got busted, and it's just kind of, he compartmentalized that. But that doesn't account for why London Town hasn't been dealt with too. And I think it just may be that it just hasn't fully come onto his radar. Too busy writing the musical version of It's a Wonderful Life, I think.
Laurence, you mentioned earlier that there might have been some tension finally between Paul and Denny towards the end of Wings.
Mm-hmm.
Are you able or willing to explore that any further as
Not really. I mean, other than, you know, I know that Jojo didn't get along with Paul and Linda. But then, you know, Denny and Jojo were kind of, you know, not long after, you know, separated anyway. I think that Denny had some frustration that the band just wasn't more active. You know, I think that and the fact that Denny was the one who brought me and Steve into the band, you know, in order to keep it going. You know, I'm not sure if Denny hadn't been kind of the talent scout, I'm not sure whether they would have like immediately kind of done what became Back to the Egg as a Wings album. Paul might have, you know, I'm just speculating now, but, you know, that he could have easily just gone into doing a solo album, you know, and having all the Columbia releases be like that. So I think that, you know, the Denny was certainly getting frustrated that it just wasn't as active as he wanted it to be. I don't think Denny really truly enjoyed the process of recording, because, you know, you can make a record in a week, or you can make a record in a year, you know. And in the case of Back to the Egg, I mean, you know, from the time we started it to the time it was released was what, about, I don't know, you know, 9-10 months. You know, could have had a baby in that time.
How was Again and Again and Again written? Did you see part of the process and the interplay between Paul and Denny? Because it was 2 songs that Paul, I believe, suggested.
Oh yeah, I mean, we were sitting there discussing the fact that Denny had these 2 songs, and Paul said, "Why don't you just put them together, make one song out of it?" You know, which is exactly what we did. That was another one we did in Scotland. That was in the first batch, and I always like that song. I think it's you know, it's the thing about Denny is that he's got this kind of interesting kind of R&B soul sensibility, but infused with kind of an English folky kind of thing too. And it's kind of, you get both of those elements in that song. That was a fun one to record.
That's why it's even more of a shame that Wings splits at that time as well. I mean, we deserved a second album from you and Steve, I think, definitely, from that lineup. It's amazing. How did you feel on that last concert coming off the stage at the Glasgow Apollo? And how did the rest of the band feel? And where did you go after that?
Well, I mean, it felt good. You know, it was a good concert. And, you know, that was the end of the bulk of the tour. I mean, Kampuchea came up after Christmas when I think we'd all had a bit too much turkey. And that was a very long show too. I mean, we didn't go on stage until quite late. But the Glasgow show, I mean, was very satisfying. And that was kind of, you know, where we were, you know, that was really the starting point for what we were going to be doing in Japan, but swapping out some songs. I know we had added Another Day was on the Japanese set list because that had been a big hit in Japan. And Let 'Em In was back in the repertoire. Live and Let Die was back in the repertoire. I don't remember anything else that was different. And I forget what we were dropping from the that Glasgow set list. But
was there an after show party after Glasgow?
I don't recall.
Must have been a good one.
I mean, there were, well, not necessarily. I was never a heavy drinker. So, I mean, after every show, there was always some kind of, you know, hang backstage. I mean, of course, now nobody does that. You know, it's like you have your pre-show, and then everybody scarpers right after they get off stage. But in those days, you'd hang out a bit afterwards. But I don't recall any kind of big bash after that, because it was not, there was no sense that this was going to be a kind of a final concert, because especially because we knew we were going to be doing Kampuchea a week later, and then going to Japan the following month.
Do you think McCartney really wanted to do the Japanese tour, especially just considering like what happened when he got there? Like, do you think it was a kind of like he was almost there's a lot of theories around that he almost got busted like deliberately, or was he kind of genuinely up for the tour?
We were pretty. I thought that we were in pretty good shape. I talked to Steve Holly the other day, who said he felt like maybe we were not quite up to par, but I thought that the new material had worked him well, and as you could tell, I mean, with the Glasgow show, the band was tight, and Paul was particular. I mean, his bass playing in that period, especially playing the Yamaha bass, which had much more robust bottom end than the Rickenbacker, that his bass playing was sensational, and he and Steve were just such a tight rhythm section. But I think that it was kind of an unfortunate circumstance. I mean, the fact that they decided that they were going to travel with half an ounce of cannabis was, not the best move. And it almost wasn't discovered. I was standing next to him, when the customs man on the very last suitcase kind of patted a jacket and then felt something inside it and lifted it up, and there was this bag of grass, and that was when all hell broke loose. But it almost, he almost got away with it.
Was there any comeback on the rest of you with the Japanese authorities there, or did they just purely focus on where it was found, whose suitcase it was in?
Well, I mean, the rest of the band had come the other way from London direct to Tokyo. I had visited a friend in New York, so I stayed at the same hotel as the McCartneys in New York, and then traveled on to Tokyo with them. And I had picked up a 1957 Les Paul Gold Top on 48th Street, which I was hand carrying with me. So when the customs people pulled us into this back area, and Linda and I were in a room, and then Paul was being interrogated basically in an adjacent room. And then a couple of the customs guys took me into a room by myself with the guitar and handed me a screwdriver. And I had to take the truss rod cover and the back plates off of the guitar to show them there was nothing stashed in there. Wow. Which was, a little kind of adding insult to injury at that point. But there was, because Paul, I think the issue there ultimately was that Paul had signed an affidavit declaring that he didn't smoke it anymore. And that was how the Justice Department were talked into giving him a work permit. And so when he got busted, some of the senior officials kind of got a little, pissed off about that, because their reputations were on the line. So that was why, they made a bigger deal out of it with Paul than they would have done with any, the reggae bands would get busted all the time, and they just take the weed away and let them do their tours. I mean.
And you were standing next to Paul at that very moment. What did he say, or what was his demeanor after that?
He turned very pale. And then, there was really, I mean, at that point, we didn't talk again until he was back in England, because he was whisked away immediately.
And what was Linda's reaction?
Oh, Linda was devastated. We were kind of hopeful that it would blow over, because when we were driving from the airport to the hotel, Paul was being detained, but Linda and the kids and I were driving to the hotel, and everywhere you looked, there were Wings posters, was like just on every street light and everything. And we thought, well, maybe this is going to blow over. But by the time we got to the hotel, it was on the news that he'd been arrested. And the next morning, all the signage had gone away. All the posters were gone.
Did it cause any tension in the band that he'd got busted and that you were like kind of looking forward to this tour?
Well, I mean, we were definitely kind of upset. I think more upset that Paul was kind of, incarcerated than anything else. But it was a disappointment, certainly. I mean, I was disappointed because I was really anticipating that the band was going to get up to the next level. Because, we'd done what, 3 weeks worth of shows, and, we were just really getting tight, as you can hear from the Glasgow show, but it could have gone further. But I just think that that was the point where, Paul and Linda were questioning whether they wanted to be on the road. And then, of course, after John died, they didn't tour again until the end of the 80s.
Were you able to visit Paul?
Hang on, you froze. Hang on, I've lost audio now.
Were you able to visit Paul in jail?
No, oh no. We were, in fact, after we'd been in Japan for about 3 days, they said, okay, it's time to leave. It's going to be better for Paul if you're not here. So everybody left. The whole band and the whole crew left. And I went to LA. I got off the plane and went to Venice Beach, and there was someone selling T-shirts with Wings Japan tour cancelled.
Did you buy one?
I did. I don't know what happened to it, but I did buy one. Yeah.
Laurence, can I just ask you, this question is a slight tangent. It was just a thing you mentioned earlier. It's just about Scotland, really. I've always been really curious to know what it was like up there on the farm in Scotland. I mean, I've read all kinds of accounts of it, mainly from the Back to the Egg days, various stories of just how rough it was and how out of the way it was and how difficult it was potentially. What was it like being cooped up there, miles from anywhere?
I mean, you're not really cooped up because you're surrounded by, Scottish scenery, and a lot of rabbits. The fields at night, you'd shine the headlights on a field and it would be all like, thousands of rabbits. I enjoyed it because I had spent, I grew up in London. I never really got to be out in the countryside for any length of time. And I'd spent the previous 3-4 years basically being in the studio 7 days a week. So, being able to get out into this kind of bucolic, Scottish scenery was not unpleasant. The way that it was set up was that we were, to begin with, there was a barn, which is what became the studio. But then there was another kind of like a recreation room that we actually used for rehearsing in to begin with. And if you went upstairs, there was kind of like a dormitory where there were separate bedrooms. They weren't fully enclosed, but there was privacy. And then there was the cottage a little further down the way. At one point I stayed in the cottage, but when we first went up there, we were all in this kind of little dormitory space. For me, I enjoyed it. Hey, I mean, I've been plucked out of the recording studio. I'm in Scotland working with Paul McCartney, and it's, it was a life-changing thing. And now, in the context, my father had passed away a month before I joined the band, so my life was kind of undergoing a major turn at that point. So I enjoyed the process. It was a little different, as time went on, when we went down to Lim Castle and we're staying at a hotel in down on the south coast, and then back to Abbey Road, where I was actually in. I had just bought a little house in London, and so I could stay in, staying in my own place, and it was interesting being in these different environments too. Being in a medieval castle is kind of a cool place to make a record. Challenging acoustically, but cool. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's like the work is the focus. When the work is the focus, then everything else kind of falls, kind of fits into that context. I mean, touring as a solo acoustic guitar player is not necessarily the easiest thing to do, but the gig is the focus. So everything else, the travel side of it is just supportive of that. But it was a great experience for me. I mean, I look at it, I described it as I got my bachelor's degree from London University and my master's from McCartney University. It was a great education because I was just soaking in all of it, whether it was the writing or the arranging, the recording, the production, just all of that stuff. So I certainly had no complaints about that. But, and socializing, I mean, there was in Campbelltown. Now, the sad thing is that now Campbelltown is one of the great Scotch whiskey places. But then it was really, they weren't distilling whiskey in Campbell. They had in the past, and they do now, but the economy around there had kind of dipped. But there was a hotel some of the crew was staying at with a decent bar and food, and we could go there and relax. And there were things along the way. I mean, I remember at one point we got a screening of the Buddy Holly story at a cinema that was up there, where the I think it was the director came up and did it. And then there was a point where the playwright Willie Russell came and hung out with us for a week and wrote, subsequently wrote a script for a movie called Band on the Run, of which I am a character. I'm a character in a Willie Russell script. But that was sidelined later in favor of Give My Regards to Broad Street.
What a pity.
It wasn't boring. Let me say that.
Was it plumbed in by then?
I'm sorry?
Was it plumbed in by the time you were there? Was the running water and amenities and everything on the farm?
We had running water.
Mm.
I mean, I don't know about earlier. No, I mean, it was relatively civilized. I mean, the newspaper didn't get delivered in the morning, but there were cars available to go into Campbelltown and pick up supplies or whatever.
So can I ask you about the Again and Again and Again video, because it's my favorite of all of the Back to the Egg videos. You in the field. Oh,
in the field, yeah.
With Linda putting flowers in your hair. It seems like you were having a blast. And
it's fun.
Paul's playing acoustic guitar, even though he's actually playing bass. If you watch the video, he's actually trying to play bass on the acoustic guitar.
Actually, I'm surprised. Well, his Zemaitis acoustic bass, which is the one that he played on To You, is a little too big to really play standing up comfortably.
Yeah.
So when you're doing videos, I mean, you're just playing along with the record. I don't think anybody really expects to actually watch your fingers and see what you're really doing.
But what was that like? I mean, were they playing the song? Were you playing along to a recording of the song in the field, or what happened?
Yeah, no, I mean, you always do these things to playback.
And was it a fun session? How long did it take, that particular thing, that video?
Probably an afternoon. I honestly don't remember. I mean, we did a bunch of videos in just in a few days. I remember being in the aircraft hangar for Spin It On, because they had behind us, there was behind the stage, there was this huge bank of spotlights, and we were wearing like fur-lined flight jackets, And the amount of heat that was coming off these lights. I mean, when I took that jacket off when I got home that night, I hung it up, and 3 days later it was still dripping. I mean, it was like we were soaked.
Do you still have the jacket?
Nah.
Oh,
I think
what a shame.
when I left England, a few things I gave as gifts to my cleaning lady because she was such a nice woman.
What about the red jacket you've got on the front cover of Back to the Egg? Is that still with you?
No, I think I outgrew that years ago.
Surely.
I still have the, there was a kind of a maroon jacket that was the tour jacket, the UK tour jacket with a kind of a faux fur collar. I have that. And I have the Japanese, the Udo tour jacket. That's like a baseball jacket, blue one. And I have a scarf that has the Rockestra, was a Rockestra scarf, and a little bracelet, a Back to the Egg bracelet too.
Yeah.
Just a few things that kind